It is March 2026. Just hours ago, satellite phones aboard oil tankers in the Persian Gulf began ringing with the same urgent message. Turn around. Do not attempt to transit. The strait is no longer safe. Captains who have sailed these waters for 20 or 30 years, men who have navigated hurricanes, wars, and pirate-infested corridors, were gripping their radios with trembling hands and making the same call. Stop the engines. Drop anchor. Wait. But wait for what? Nobody could tell them. Because what was unfolding in the waters below them, what was silently spreading across the blue floor of the world's most important waterway, was something that had not been seen in decades. It was something ancient, something terrifyingly simple, and something that was about to bring the entire global economy to its knees. We are talking about naval mines, small, cheap, and almost laughably low-tech compared to the hypersonic missiles and drone swarms dominating the headlines. In the hands of Iran, deployed at the precise choke point where 1/5 of the world's oil flows every single day, these weapons have just done something no missile could. They have trapped 1,650 ships. They have frozen the Persian Gulf. They have sent oil prices past $100 a barrel for the first time in years, with official whispers from Tehran itself that $200 is coming next. This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. This is happening right now in March 2026, and it is the most consequential maritime crisis in the history of modern warfare. If you think this does not affect you because you do not live near the Persian Gulf, you need to stay with me. By the time this is over, you will understand exactly why the fuel in your car, the medicine in your hospital, the food in your grocery store, and the stability of every economy on Earth are connected to what Iran just did in a body of water most people could not find on a map. To understand why this crisis exploded the way it did, you need to understand the geography of the most strategically loaded piece of ocean on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. Say that name out loud, Hormuz. It sounds almost mythological, like something from an ancient epic. In a way, it is. The strait sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, a narrow passage between Iran to the north and the Arabian Peninsula to the south. At its narrowest point, it is just 21 miles wide. You could drive that in under 20 minutes on a clear highway. But through those 21 miles flows approximately 17 to 21 million barrels of crude oil every single day. That is roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply, 1/5 through one tiny gap. Every ship carrying oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar must pass through that narrow corridor. There is no alternative, no back road, and no bypass. Hormuz is the only door out. Iran knows this. For decades, Iranian military strategists have asked themselves one simple question. What would happen if we closed that door? The answer they calculated was total, complete, and economically catastrophic for the entire Western-aligned world. In March 2026, following a series of events so dramatic they still feel almost impossible to believe, Iran finally decided to find out. In late February 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran in an operation called Epic Fury. The targets were Iran's military installations, nuclear sites, missile stockpiles, and leadership. The Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East for nearly 4 decades, was killed. Iran's government was thrown into chaos, and almost immediately the retaliation began. Missiles rained on Israeli cities, U.S. military bases across the Gulf were hit. Then quietly, without fanfare or the dramatic television footage of missiles lighting up the night sky, Iranian naval units began doing something far more subtle and far more dangerous. They began seeding the Strait of Hormuz with mines. The weapon Iran chose to unleash on the world's shipping lanes was not cutting edge. It was not science fiction. It was not some classified technology reverse-engineered from a downed American drone. The naval mine is one of the oldest weapons in modern warfare. The concept dates back to the American Civil War, when Confederate forces used primitive explosive devices to protect their harbors. In World War I, the British and German navies scattered millions of them across the North Sea. In World War II, American aircraft dropped mines across Japanese ports in Operation Starvation, which genuinely starved Japan's war economy. In 1988, in these same waters, an Iranian M08 naval mine, a design invented in the early 1900s, struck the USS Samuel B. Roberts and nearly sank it. Repairs cost $90 million. The mine itself was worth approximately $500. This is the brutal mathematics of mine warfare. The attacker spends almost nothing, and the defender spends everything. Iran has between 2,000 and 6,000 of these weapons, stockpiled, produced domestically, and sourced from China and Russia. They do not need to lay all of them. They do not even need to sink a ship. All they need to do is create the perception of danger, because in the shipping world, perception is reality. The moment a Lloyd's of London insurance underwriter marks a sea lane as a war risk zone, freight rates explode. Captains refuse to transit, shipping companies reroute, and the global supply chain begins to choke. That is exactly what has happened. Within days of the mining operation beginning, tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz dropped by 70%, then 80%. Then, for all practical purposes, it dropped to zero. Ships already in the Gulf found themselves trapped. Captains received orders to anchor and wait. 138 container ships carrying nearly 500,000 shipping containers were stuck west of the strait with nowhere to go. 55 Chinese-flagged vessels alone were caught in the Gulf with no way out. 15,000 passengers on at least 6 major cruise ships found themselves stranded in the middle of an active war zone, their vacation itineraries replaced by military briefings and evacuation protocols. Outside the strait, hundreds more vessels sat at anchor, waiting for a clearance that was not coming. In total, counting every vessel affected, trapped inside, holding outside, or rerouted, the number reaches 1,650 ships. This is an armada of floating commerce frozen in place by mines the size of refrigerators. Imagine looking down at the Persian Gulf from orbit. Normally, it looks like a busy highway with ships moving in clean lanes and a constant flow of tankers heading out and empty vessels heading in. Now, imagine that highway suddenly stopped, every vehicle parked, and every engine idling. The lanes are empty except for the occasional military vessel moving fast and low, scanning for mines. That is what satellite imagery showed in the first week of March 2026. A maritime parking lot, the largest forced standstill in the history of ocean shipping. Iran has only used a small fraction of its mines. Analysts estimate that Iran has deployed perhaps a few dozen mines so far, maybe 100 at the most, out of a stockpile of potentially 6,000. This means Iran is sitting on roughly 80 to 90% of its mine-laying capacity, still held in reserve like a gun with thousands of rounds in the magazine. The message is unmistakable. We can make this much worse. We are choosing not to for now. That kind of calculated threat is more frightening than all-out escalation because it means Iran has leverage. The economic consequences cascaded faster than anyone predicted. On the first day the strait effectively closed, Brent crude oil prices spiked sharply. Within a week, they had climbed past $100 per barrel, a rise of more than 38% compared to pre-war prices. The International Energy Agency called this the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. 15 million barrels of crude oil and 5 million barrels of oil products were stranded in the Gulf every single day. Refineries in Asia that depend on Gulf crude began drawing down emergency reserves. Fuel prices at gas stations from Seoul to Stuttgart began climbing. In Tehran, an Iranian military spokesperson said calmly, "Get ready for oil at $200 a barrel because the price of oil depends on regional security that you have destabilized." This was not bluster. It was a strategic announcement. Iran was telling the world it was prepared to make the consequences last as long as necessary. The ripple effects spread to every corner of the global economy. In Pakistan, schools closed and the government mandated 4-day work weeks to conserve fuel. In India, restaurants and hotels were shuttered to preserve cooking oil and energy. In Thailand, government employees were told to skip the elevator to reduce power consumption. These are quiet, grinding adaptations to a crisis that began with a few dozen metal spheres dropped into a narrow stretch of water. This is globalization's Achilles heel made visible. We built a world of unprecedented interconnection and just-in-time supply chains, and we threaded nearly a fifth of all the oil keeping that world running through a gap 21 miles wide. Now, someone has put a lock on that gap. The United States responded with overwhelming force. American naval and air assets began hunting Iranian mine layers immediately. Over the first 10 days of the conflict, U.S. forces sank 50 Iranian naval vessels using artillery, fighter jets, bombers, and sea-launched cruise missiles. 16 Iranian mine-laying craft were specifically targeted and destroyed near the strait. President Trump directed the Navy to explore options for escorting commercial tankers through the strait, similar to Operation Earnest Will in the late 1980s. Back then, the U.S. reflagged Kuwaiti tankers and sent warships to escort them. It worked mostly, but the threat environment today is vastly more complex. Iran's arsenal has grown enormously. While world attention focused on airstrikes, Iran had been building a mosquito fleet of 250 to 300 fast attack craft armed with anti-ship missiles. They are like a cloud of angry hornets, individually small, collectively lethal, and almost impossible to neutralize completely. These vessels carry precision missiles like the Nasir and the Kosar, accurate within meters. The longer-range Qadr missile extends that reach to 300 kilometers, and the Abu Mahdi missile can reportedly exceed 1,000 kilometers. Iran has built a web of overlapping weapon systems that makes operating in the Persian Gulf dangerous for any ship Iran targets. They have demonstrated they are willing to use these weapons against commercial shipping. By mid-March 2026, at least 19 commercial vessels had been damaged. 16 attacks on ships in a single week were documented. Ships with connections to countries supporting the U.S. or Israel were targeted preferentially, while neutral-flagged vessels were largely left alone. Iran was turning the world's most important shipping lane into a geopolitical sorting machine. Even at the height of this crisis, Iranian oil was still moving. While Western-connected tankers sat at anchor, Iranian crude threaded its way out through carefully arranged corridors. This was a selective embargo enforced by military force. The UN Security Council convened an emergency session and passed a resolution condemning Iran's actions as a breach of international law. The response from the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, was that the strait would remain closed as a tool of pressure for as long as Iran chose. Iran has been preparing for this asymmetric warfare for decades. The United States Navy is the most powerful in history, but a mine war or a swarm attack is a different kind of battle. The target is not American military power. The target is the global economy's dependency on Gulf oil and the political will of governments whose citizens are watching fuel prices climb. This strategy is known as sea denial. You do not need to control the seas. You just need to prevent your enemy from using them freely. Strategic oil reserves were activated almost immediately in the largest coordinated emergency drawdown in history. However, reserves are finite. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve holds roughly 700 million barrels, which is less than 6 weeks of combined exports from Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait. The clock is ticking. Mine clearing is no simple task. Modern countermeasures are specialized, slow, and dangerous. Clearing a major minefield in a contested environment is one of the most technically challenging operations in naval warfare. Iran can deploy mines faster than anyone can clear them, and the strait is deep and wide enough to hide hundreds of weapons. Security briefings quietly discuss a scenario where the strait does not reopen for months. Rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope adds weeks to each journey, increasing costs and reducing shipping capacity. While some pipelines bypass the strait, their capacity is nowhere near sufficient. The world has no good alternative. The crisis of March 2026 is the bill coming due for decades of willful dependency. The world knew the Strait of Hormuz was vulnerable, but nothing changed because the oil was cheap and nobody wanted to spend the money to build genuine resilience. Now, governments are discovering what that resilience would have been worth. The 1,650 trapped ships represent the crystallization of a vulnerability the global economy chose to maintain for the sake of short-term convenience. March 2026 is the moment that assumption broke. What happens next is uncertain. The mine war could intensify, or back-channel diplomacy could produce a ceasefire. What is certain is that the world's relationship with the Persian Gulf will never be the same. The vulnerability has been demonstrated and the choke point has been closed. Every government and supply chain manager now knows it can happen again. Somewhere in those 21 miles of blue water, a few dozen metal spheres filled with high explosives are sitting on the seafloor. They have done what no missile strike or sanctions package could. They have stopped the world.